I'm Professor Singer sharing with you something very important. I want you to understand the hidden strategies used by the West to keep Africa poor and what Tharaka Invention Academy is doing about it and how. In an interview with Fadhel Kaboub, a Tunisian economist named Fadhel Kaboub, who advocates for a new approach to development in Africa, he argued that the continent's economic structures are deeply rooted in colonialism and must be decolonized. Kaboub emphasizes the need for African countries to prioritize food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and a Pan-African industrial policy to achieve genuine independence. He criticizes the current development models promoted by organizations like the World Bank and IMF, which he sees as perpetuating economic dependency. Kaboub proposes a bargain of the century where Africa and the global South collaborate with China and other countries to share technology and build a new multipolar world based on equitable development. The argument for Tharaka Invention Academy's development of online courses to train innovators, inventors, and problem solvers is rooted in the profound need to equip individuals with the tools to confront and dismantle systemic barriers, both local and global, that stifle economic independence and self-reliance. The Academy's mission is not just timely but essential. Let's hear from two prominent podcasters to hear what they have to say about Mr. Kaboub's timely message.
You sent in that interview with Fadhel Kaboub from Learning Never Stops. I have to admit, I was a bit skeptical. I mean, the idea of Africa, leading a green energy revolution and reshaping global trade, it felt a bit kind of like a far-off utopia. But listening to him, let me tell you, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
He certainly doesn't shy away from bold claims. Like, Kaboub's central argument, is that true independence for Africa? It goes way beyond, just flags and anthems he's talking about.
Yeah.
Achieving food sovereignty, becoming a dominant force in energy, and breaking free from the systems that keep the continent economically dependent.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. One of the most striking things Kaboub said is that the whole idea of Africa being a poor continent is actually a myth.
Right, and it's a myth that's been used to justify centuries of exploitation. Kaboub points out that Africa is incredibly rich in resources. In fact, he argues that those resources, they're precisely why it was colonized in the first place, and why it continues to be exploited today.
So the narrative we're often told, that Africa needs help from the outside world, is actually masking the reality that its wealth is being extracted to benefit others.
Exactly. And to keep this extraction going, there are systems in place that deliberately keep Africa dependent. Kaboub breaks this down into what he calls the 3 structural traps.
I'm intrigued. What's the first trap?
The first one is the food deficit. Think about this. Africa currently imports a staggering 85% of its food. This is a continent that was historically a breadbasket for the world.
It's almost unbelievable. How did that happen?
Kaboub traces this shift back to the post-World War II era and the rise of heavily subsidized agriculture in Europe and North America. He specifically calls out the European Common Agricultural Policy, which was implemented in 1962.
So these policies flooded the market with cheap, subsidized crops, making it impossible for African farmers to compete.
Exactly. African farmers were pushed to abandon growing food for their own populations and instead focus on cash crops for export, things like coffee, cocoa, and cotton. This created a dependence on imports for basic foodstuffs.
And this dependence continues to this day, even though Africa has the potential to feed itself. So what's the second trap?
The second trap is the energy deficit. What's fascinating here is that Africa has the potential to generate 1,000 times its current energy needs through renewable sources like solar, wind, and hydro.
1,000 times, that's mind-blowing. But we know that much of Africa still struggles with energy poverty. How can those two things coexist?
Kaboub argues that this is a deliberate strategy. He says Africa is being actively denied access to the technology and investment needed to develop its renewable energy potential.
And why would anyone want to do that?
He believes it's all about maintaining control. Powerful nations and corporations benefit from the current energy order. A truly energy-independent Africa would disrupt that order and challenge their dominance.
So it's not a lack of resources or capacity holding Africa back, but a deliberate effort to keep it reliant on external energy sources.
Precisely. And this leads us to the third trap, the manufacturing deficit. African nations are mostly stuck in low value-added manufacturing.
What does that mean in practical terms?
It means they're forced to import most of the machinery, fuel, components, even the packaging, for their own manufacturing processes.
So they're trapped at the bottom of the value chain, extracting raw materials, and then paying a premium to import finished goods.
Exactly. And all three of these deficits, food, energy, and manufacturing, they come together to create a chronic trade imbalance that weakens African currencies.
And that, of course, leads to the debt trap Kaboub talks about.
Right. These weak currencies mean imports become more expensive, leading to inflation, especially on essential goods. Governments are then forced to subsidize those goods to keep them affordable, which further strains their budgets. This, in turn, forces them to borrow more, deepening the debt spiral.
It's a vicious cycle that seems almost impossible to escape. But what about the international institutions that are supposed to help countries in these situations? The IMF, the World Bank, where do they fit into all of this?
Kaboub is very critical of those institutions. He argues that, having been designed during the colonial era, they actually perpetuate the very problems they claim to solve. Their policies often lead to more debt independence, not less.
He even suggests that they're failures. They aren't just accidental. He questions their motives and competence, implying their actions might be deliberate. That's a pretty serious accusation.
It certainly is. And it's bound to ruffle some feathers. He doesn't stop there. He's equally skeptical of what are often touted as green solutions. Initiatives like the EU's Matai plan, he argues, are just another form of greenwashing.
So you're saying that even these seemingly well-intentioned efforts might not be as beneficial for Africa as they're presented?
That's Kaboub's contention. He believes these initiatives are primarily about securing cheap resources and markets for Europe, all under the guise of promoting sustainable development.
What about initiatives closer to home? He also critiques the African Union's Agenda 2063, right? That's supposed to be a roadmap for Africa's development, led by Africans themselves.
He applauds the vision behind Agenda 2063, but points out the lack of real progress in implementing it. He sees the AU's reliance on external funding and the crushing debt burden faced by many member states as major obstacles to achieving its ambitious goals.
So if all these existing solutions are flawed, where do we go from here? Thankfully, Kaboub doesn't just leave us with a list of problems. He actually offers a pretty radical alternative.
Right. This is where he introduces his idea of a geopolitical bargain. And this is where things get really interesting. His vision starts with collective action. He believes a critical mass of African nations need to come together and form a powerful bloc.
A kind of economic and political alliance.
Exactly. A bloc that can leverage their combined resources and market potential to reshape global trade on their own terms.
That sounds great in theory, but wouldn't that be incredibly difficult to pull off? African nations have a history of being pitted against each other, competing for resources and influence.
Kaboub recognizes that. He acknowledges that historical rivalries and current political tensions make this kind of unity a challenge. He's calling for a fundamental shift in thinking, a move away from competition, towards genuine cooperation for mutual benefit.
So he's not just talking about economic policy here. This is about a fundamental shift in the political landscape of Africa, a new kind of Pan-Africanism that goes beyond rhetoric and translates into real, tangible action.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes that for this bloc to be successful, it needs to address its internal vulnerabilities. Things like food security, access to energy, and even regional security threats need to be tackled head on.
It's like he's saying, you can't leverage your power on the global stage if you're not strong and stable at home.
This bloc needs to be resilient, able to withstand external pressure and resist attempts to divide and conquer. It can't be reliant on outside forces for its basic needs, because that creates a vulnerability that can be exploited.
So the first step is building a strong and unified front within Africa itself. But how does this bloc then go about reshaping the global economic order?
This is where Kaboub's proposal gets really audacious. He suggests forming a strategic partnership with China.
China. I can already hear the alarm bells going off in certain circles. Why China specifically?
Kaboub argues that China, unlike the traditional Western powers, has a vested interest in seeing a more prosperous and influential Africa. He points out that China already has a massive manufacturing base and the technological expertise across the entire renewable energy supply chain.
So he's not suggesting China would simply exploit Africa's resources.
No, he's proposing a genuine partnership. Africa offers access to its resources and markets, and in return, China helps build a complete end-to-end renewable energy manufacturing capacity within Africa.
So essentially, partnering with China to jumpstart Africa's green energy sector and break its dependence on imported technology.
Precisely. And once this partnership is established, and the bloc has achieved a certain level of energy independence. They can then leverage that newfound power to negotiate with other global players. He suggests going to countries like Germany, the US, or France, and offering them the same deal: access to resources and markets in exchange for specific technologies.
It's like he's turning the tables, using the very systems that have kept Africa dependent to create leverage and rewrite the rules of the game.
Exactly. It's a bold, some might say audacious strategy. But Kaboub argues that if we're serious about tackling the massive challenges facing humanity, climate change, poverty, inequality, we can't afford to cling to outdated models and incremental approaches. We need to be willing to think big and embrace radical solutions.
So it's not about picking sides or creating a new global hegemon, but about forcing the existing powers to the negotiating table and demanding a fairer deal for Africa, and, by extension, for the entire global South.
It's a vision that challenges the very foundations of the existing global order. He's calling for a reimagining of global economics, a system where resources are shared more equitably, and sustainability is at the forefront.
He's painting a picture of a very different future, one where the global South isn't just a source of cheap labor and raw materials, but a driving force in shaping a more just and sustainable world. But even if we accept the premise, there are still a lot of practical questions to consider. How would this impact existing trade agreements and international institutions? What about the potential for pushback from those who benefit from the status quo? Those are huge questions it feels like we're talking about. Like
Complete.
Overhaul the global economic architecture, not just some minor tweaks. But before we get into those complexities, I think it's important to step back and consider what this vision means for us. You know, the individuals listening to this deep dive. Where do we fit into this grand scheme of things?
That's where Kaboub's message gets really powerful. He's not just talking to politicians and economists. He's speaking to each and every one of us, challenging us to look in the mirror and examine our own complicity in the systems he's critiquing.
So it's not enough to just sit back and admire the vision. He's asking us to take responsibility for our own actions and the impact those actions have on the world.
Exactly. He's asking us to question our own consumer choices. Where do the products we buy come from? Who made them? What were the environmental and social costs of their production? These are questions we often avoid asking ourselves.
It's so easy to get caught up in the convenience and affordability of our modern lifestyles. We rarely stop to think about the hidden costs behind the things we buy.
And those hidden costs, they're often borne by communities in the global South. Kaboub's vision forces us to acknowledge the interconnectedness of our lives. The choices we make here, they have a direct impact on the lives of people thousands of miles away.
So it's not just about making ethical choices as consumers, but about recognizing our shared humanity and the impact our actions have on others.
He argues that true solidarity goes beyond just donating to a charity or feeling sorry for those less fortunate. It requires a deeper understanding of the systems that create and maintain inequality and a willingness to challenge those systems, even when it's uncomfortable.
He's calling for a more critical and engaged approach to citizenship, not just within our own countries, but on a global level.
Right. He wants us to become more informed about global issues, to hold our leaders accountable for their policies and actions, to support organizations and movements that are working to create a more just and sustainable world.
It's like he's saying, we need to move beyond passive observation and become active participants in shaping a better future.
Kaboub's interview is a powerful reminder that the world isn't a fixed entity. It's constantly being shaped and reshaped by the actions of individuals, communities, and nations. And it's up to each of us to decide what role we want to play in creating the future we want to see.
He leaves us with a very clear challenge. Are we content to just go along with the status quo, accepting things as they are? Or are we willing to step up and demand a better world? It's a question that requires some serious self-reflection.
He's not offering easy answers or simplistic solutions. He's presenting us with a vision that requires both individual and collective action. It's a vision that challenges us to rethink our values, our priorities, and our very way of being in the world.
This deep dive has been a real journey. We started off exploring the economic realities of Africa, and we've ended up contemplating our own roles and responsibilities in shaping a more just and sustainable future for all.
And that, I think, is the true power of Kaboub's message. He's not just talking about economics. He's talking about a fundamental shift in consciousness, a shift towards a more interconnected, compassionate, and ultimately more humane way of being in the world.
Wow. That brings us to the end of our deep dive into Fadhel Kaboub's vision for a decolonized economic future. It's been a thought-provoking conversation, and I hope it sparked some new ideas and questions for you.
As always, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, to challenge your own assumptions, and to seek out further information. The resources we've discussed will be available in the show notes.
Remember, understanding is the first step towards change. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Hello, dear friends. My name is Professor Singer, and I teach invention courses at Tharaka Invention Academy in Kenya. Whether you're just starting your creative journey or already nurturing your inventive spirit, our academy, through its book, The Strategic Application of Ever So Powerful Artificial Intelligence, as well as its online courses, equips you with the tools and guidance to transform ideas into impactful solutions. Innovation is for everyone, and together, we can turn challenges into opportunities and make a transformative difference in your life, your career, your community, and perhaps the world. We'd love to join you in your journey.